Good morning. Welcome back. And,
One of these?
it's this one.
Okay.
This is the one. Thank you. The prodigal remote has returned. I don't have to climb on the chair and entertain you anymore. The piece of paper that was getting passed out to you is a little bit of a primer to help you understand David and his life. And then I realized that those are only the wives that he had when he was in Hebron, and didn't include the ones that he picked up when he was in Jerusalem. And so, but that's in today's lesson. I'd like to do just a quick review of last week, and what are some of the things you see in the illustration?
People.
You got people and they're walking, yep. And you can, why is there a big question mark on the screen?
They weren't.
Yeah, well, we didn't know which one of the RDs it was, whether it was the reeds, the Sea of Reeds, or the Red Sea, and we decided it's not really that important which one it was. The important thing is they made it across. The Egyptians didn't. Just following down, what about the red thing and the white thing standing up? The fire in the cloud, yep. God's presence often shows up as cloud or fire, or cloud or smoke and fire or lightning. So that's pretty normal. And all of these names usually mean, like number one, Mara means, does anyone remember? Bitter, yeah. And my wife actually had a friend from Bible camp named Mara, and then her last name was spelled H-J-E-L-L-E. So Norwegians know that would be jelly. So her name was Mara Jelly, which would mean
Bitter jelly.
bitter jelly. You know, need to add more sugar. And Kibroth Hatava, that's a name of a place, but that's the place where, remember when they were begging for quail or meat? We want meat, and God gave them meat.
Yes.
And while the meat was still stuck between their teeth, he struck them dead. That means graves of craving. And so a lot of these different names have reasons to them. They become Ebenezer's of sorts, as we talked about in our hymn this week. And down here we have, what mount is that? Sinai. Sometimes it's called Horeb in other parts of the Old Testament. And there's a big tablet, and the big tablet stands for the covenant, yep. And the little set of tablets, the Ten Commandments. They're only part of the covenant. And then, why did they come up here and get turned back? Well, you'd think they were lost, but actually they had a chance to go in right here and take the land.
They weren't confident in God.
They didn't trust God. 10 of the 12 spies said, we can't take them. Only 2 of the spies said, this is a good land. The Lord is giving it to us. We can go take it. But then, so of all the people who left Egypt, how many of those who left eventually made it in? Just 2. Joshua and Caleb, the only 2. Incidentally, they were the 2 spies who said, we could take this. They were the only 2 who trusted God. And I'll skip all the quotes. And we talked about manna, and when they got into the land, they finally celebrated the Passover in the land, and the manna stopped. And we talked about in the book of Joshua, it looks like it's a unified Israel going in and capturing the land. And you got Joshua blowing on a ram's horn, and the shofar would be the Hebrew name for it. And then, of course, you have this crazy understanding of how agriculture works, thinking that the goddess lives in the earth and the male god lives in the cloud, and when he does his thing, she does her thing, and you get crops. And of course, the Baal worship involves reminding these gods of what to do. And when we get to the book of Judges, we see that the annihilation of the inhabitants of the land was nowhere near as complete, because you still have Moabites and Ammonites and people causing problems, and Canaanites. And so if they had destroyed it as completely as Joshua suggests, they probably wouldn't have had the problems. But then maybe there is a problem in obliterating a whole group of people. But then, when you go back to Genesis, you learn how those people came to be, and it gives you some justification as to why you can be rid of them. And then, of course, we talked about the pattern in Judges. We rushed through this really quickly. But when you read through the book of Judges, it starts out, and there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. There was no governmental authority. So, get a load of this. The Israelites did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. You could almost just change the name, King Eglon of Moab, to a different name, and you're in a different chapter of Judges. The form is the same, the details change. They did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, in alliance with the Ammonites and the Amalekites. He went and defeated Israel. They took possession of the city of palms. Israelites served King Eglon 18 years. Then they cried out to the Lord, and the Lord raises up Ehud, son of Gera, the Benjaminite, a left-handed man. And that becomes important because after he delivers the taxes to Eglon and the other guys go, and he catches him up in the room, and I have a secret message of you for the king. And he says, I have a message for you from God. And when he's leaning over to tell him the message, he reaches in under his robe with his left hand, pulls out the sword, thrusts it in to Eglon. The hilt went in after the blade. The fat closed in after the blade. The dirt came out, and Ehud went out, locked the doors, locked him in the bathroom, basically. And you know how it is. If someone gets locked in the bathroom, you say after 20 minutes, you might say, you know, the rest of us need to get in here. And sure enough, when they saw the doors were locked, they thought he must be relieving himself. And they waited till they were embarrassed. He still didn't open up the roof chamber. They opened up, and there was their Lord dead on the floor. Of course, Ehud escapes. He goes to the sculptured stones. He sounds the trumpet. They go out into battle. They defeat Eglon's army. And of course, and it says, no one escaped. So there should be no Moabites left. There should be no Amalekites left. There should be no Amorites left. But when we get into the next book called Samuel, guess who Saul, the king of Israel, is called to defeat? The Amalekites. Well, there shouldn't be any Amalekites, but it says, and the land had rest for 80 years. And then you could just go back and say, and the people did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. The Lord raised up so-and-so to make life miserable for them. They served so-and-so for so many years. They cried out to the Lord. The Lord raised up this judge. And you just keep going through the judges. It's sporadic, charismatic leadership. There's no genealogical succession, you know, like son taking over for dad kind of thing. And that is a very quick fly-through of that one there. Any questions, wonderments before we go forward? Yes?
Continuation all the way. You know, I thought there's a lot in Lawrence of Arabia, him half-film, in talking with Alec Guinness, the conversation regarding tribes and this group and another group, and that's been going on since that time.
Yeah, and the question, I'm going to repeat the question for the video, and isn't it the case that the tribalism has been part of the fabric a long time? And it is, because you saw the 12 tribes there, and if I were to go back to I'm going to do that just because it would be good to do. The tribalism is kind of rampant, and it's not gone. It's still around to this day. Tribalism. There it is. I'm going to sneak down here. This picture right here, you see that the different tribes have different places. Like, for instance, Dan settled here first, but they were right next door to the Philistines. And the Philistines made their life so miserable, Dan goes way up here to the north and takes that land from somebody else. They got as far away from the Philistines as they could. They'd had it with them as neighbors. And you get, now most of these, like the kids at Bible school, if you saw the signs they had out, they had signs called Asher, they had Naphtali, they had Zebulun, Gad, Reuben, Judah, Simeon, Benjamin, Dan, but they did not have a sign that said Ephraim, and they did not have a sign that said Manasseh. Notice who gets prime territory. Ephraim and Manasseh. And they are called the half-tribes, because guess who their dad was? Joseph. You don't see a tribe called Joseph up here. Joseph's sons were Ephraim and Manasseh, and they got, by and far, the lion's share of the land. And the tribalism, yeah, I'll very quickly do this. Did I tell you about the guy who went down, this sounds like a bad joke. Did I tell you about the guy who went down to Bethlehem to get a concubine, and when he was coming north, he came to Gibeah, and the men of Gibeah, did I tell that story? Oh, the men, he was going to spend the night in Gibeah, and the men said, send out your visitors that we may know them. They were basically going to rape the guy, and he says, here, don't take me, take my concubine instead. And they end up raping his concubine all night long until she dies. And what he does in the morning then is he cuts her into 12 pieces, and he sends one piece to each tribe, and they say, can you believe such a thing happened in Israel, that she was raped? It was a vast violation of the hospitality code. In that culture, traveling in the desert, if you do not help a traveler, what might happen to the traveler? They might die. So hospitality is the key code of the land. And that they were not given hospitality. In fact, they were abused. So they rallied all of Israel to come into battle against Gibeah. But what happens is the Benjaminites all stand up for Gibeah, and there's a big fight, and the Benjaminites all end up, almost all of them end up dying except for 600 of them. And all of the other tribes said, we will not give you any of our daughters in marriage. Never. Well, that meant the death of the tribe of Benjamin, because the only way to have a Jewish child is through a Jewish womb. If you don't have a Jewish womb, you can't have a Jewish child, and the tribe's killed off. So, Jabesh-Gilead has a festival in which, at the festival, the young women of the village, the virgins, would dance around the perimeter of the village and sing songs and stuff. And they said, well, we told you we wouldn't give you any of our daughters, but we do know of this festival that's going on, and there's 400 eligible women up there, and we won't do anything if you take one. So we won't give you one, but you can take one. Well, and they went up and they took all those virgins, and there were still 200 Benjaminites who didn't have a wife, but at least 400 of them did. And it says, and thus the tribe of Benjamin was preserved, and there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. So, I mean, this takes 3 chapters in the book of Judges. It's an amazingly brutal, messy story. But what ends up happening later on is King Saul ends up getting killed, and his body gets pinned to the wall. And it says, and the valiant men of Jabesh-Gilead go and take down Saul's body and give him a burial. And you say, why would they risk their lives to pull down a dead guy? Because Saul is a Benjaminite. And if he's a Benjaminite, then he's a descendant of one of those 400 men who captured one of those 400 virgins and had children. So they're his relatives. And so you're going to see Benjaminites in the rest of the story. And every time you see Benjaminite, you need to know this story about Saul and about this mess, because otherwise the whole Benjaminite stuff will just go right over your head. And so it's important to be able to access that. Because in today's lesson, and I think we're going to need a prayer to make it through it. Let's do that. Heavenly Father, we give you thanks for the way in which your word comes to us, through the way you work through flawed people. And we pray that you'll keep working through us as you always have. And it just drives home the point that we always need your grace. Amen. Well, what do we have here? Can you tell what that is? The Ark of the Covenant. And it starts out, we're basically in the book of 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel today. And the Ark starts out in Shiloh, and that's where, if you remember the story of Samuel, sleeping near the Ark. And he hears the voice of Lord, Samuel, Samuel, and he runs to Eli and says, here I am. And he goes, I didn't call you, go back to bed. You know, you've heard that story many times about the boy Samuel being called. Well, anyway, Eli's sons, Hophni and Phinehas, are scoundrels. And Eli's getting old in age, and Hophni and Phinehas decide to take the ark out and do battle, and God strikes Hophni and Phinehas dead. The Philistines, who live down here in Gaza and Ashkelon, they capture the ark and they take it from the Battle of Aphek down to Ashdod, and the people there get infested, like with mice and fleas and bites, and they say, this has only happened since you brought the ark here. Get it out of here. So they move it to Gath, which is Goliath's hometown, and the people there get afflicted by plagues, and they say, you know, get it out of here. And one of these, same with Ekron, the same thing happens. And when they put it in the see, whenever one nation did battle with another nation, they didn't see it purely as our troops beat your troops. They also believed our God beat your God. Our God's bigger than your God. That's why we won. And so they put the ark in the temple at Ashdod, and when they came in the morning, the god Dagon was found face down, bowing to the Ark of the Covenant. So they set their god back up, and then the next morning they came, it was bowed down again. And so what ends up happening, they get to Ekron and they go, you know what? We've had it with this thing. Everywhere it's gone, it's brought nothing but troubles. So they put it on an ox cart, and then they said, if it goes somewhere specific, we'll let it go, and if it just wanders around in circles, we'll take it back. Because, you know, the thing was made of gold, so it had some worth to it besides being the Ark of the Covenant. Well, it went to Beth Shemesh. And in last Sunday's alternate first lesson, there's 2 different first lesson choices. And the one that's going through the book of Samuel said they were going to bring the Ark of the Covenant from Beth Shemesh. David was going to bring it up. And they put it on a brand new cart. that had never hauled anything. Why do you think they would use a brand new cart? Would you want to put it in a cart you'd use to haul manure?
No.
No. They wanted to make sure that it was clean. So they put it in a new cart, and they're doing this trip from Beth Shemesh to Kiryat Jearim, and it said every 6 steps they took, they stopped and they sacrificed a calf. And David is dancing with all his might before the Lord, traveling up the road. And what happens is, there's 2 guys, Uzzah and Omri. Well, Uzzah's Omri's son. Well, anyway, Uzzah, the cart is being pulled by oxen, it jostles, and he reaches out to steady the ark, he touches it, and God strikes him dead. And it says, and the place was called Perez Uzzah, at which, of course, if you translate into English, Perez means bursting out against, and it's where God burst out against Uzzah. Well, so let's say you're in this procession and this guy touches the ark and God strikes him dead, and you were bringing the ark to your house. Would you keep bringing the ark to your house? No? So David says, hey, Obed-Edom, you live right here. How about I leave the ark at your place for a little while? Remember what happened to all the Philistines as they kept the ark in their place. They were afflicted and cursed, and I don't want it, and so they left it with Obed-Edom for 3 months, and Obed-Edom prospered. And so then David came back and they got the ark and they brought it to Jerusalem. And something about when he was dancing before the Lord, he wasn't wearing all that much clothing. An ephod might be it, and that could either be worn over the chest or over the lap area, is a generous way to describe it. And, oh, we got so much to do. So anyway, you're going to see the Philistines can keep making excursions into the land. Beth Shean is the place where King Saul gets killed and Jonathan gets killed, and they take and they pin his body to the wall as a sign. And that's where the men of Jabesh Gilead, oh, back up. You see the Amorites here? They come up to Jabesh Gilead and they lay siege to the town, and they said, we'll back off and let you go in and out and get food and supplies if you let us gouge out the right eye of each man and cut off the hand of each man, one hand. Well, that was a pretty steep price to pay. Well, then Saul goes up and he liberates Jabesh Gilead. And you think, why would Saul have gone up to liberate Jabesh Gilead from the Ammonites? Remember, what tribe is Saul from? Benjamin. And how did these Benjaminites get wives? From the 400 that were dancing around Jabesh Gilead. So when Saul goes up there to rescue those people, he's not disinterested. These are his relatives. And without that study in Judges, you wouldn't know why Saul would risk his life to save these people, or why these people would risk their lives to pull his body down and give him a burial. It's because those are their near relatives, that tribalism, Jim, that you talked about. Because there's still tribalism going on in this lesson. Okay. Now remember, in Judges, you'd have a judge here, a judge there, a judge here, a judge there, but there was never any continuity. There was no national unity. It was sort of every tribe did their own thing. But up here, who do you think this guy is? Yep, that's David. And we have our familiar symbol for God. And instead of one crown, yeah, we have a row of crowns, because God promised David that his descendant would be on the throne forever, which is really different than for a short term. And so we have a lot going on in this picture. You see this part down here? This is the tribe of Judah. And David becomes king in Hebron. And he's there for several years, like 7 years. And he captures Jerusalem. The Jebusites lived in Jerusalem. And they made fun of David. They said, "Our blind and our lame could keep you from entering this city," because it was a walled city. It was a fortified city. And they said, "We have such good defenses that our blind and our lame could keep you out of here." So they discover the water shaft. And they go in, and David says, "I want you to make sure that you kill all of the blind and the lame." And when the temple gets built in Jerusalem, guess who is banned from entering the temple? The blind and the lame are not allowed in the temple. David's not the nice guy necessarily that you think him to be. What else do we got? Okay, so after 7 years in Hebron, the northern tribes remained loyal to Saul. Saul had a son named Ishbaal who lived, and he was reigning in the north. And again, Jabesh Gilead plays a prominent role. And something strange happens. Okay. So Saul has been trying to kill David. Even though David loves Saul, he's his son Jonathan's best friend, Saul thinks David's out to get him. Samuel had anointed David to be king. Remember that story about the sons of Jesse, and he looks at the firstborn and he says, "Hey, this guy's a king," and God says, "Nope, not him." Every son went by, and then finally he says, "You got any other ones?" And they go, "Yeah, the runt of the litter, he's out watching the sheep." "Well, bring him to me." And he says, "This is the king," and he anoints David king while Saul is still king. But David will not kill Saul. But Saul thinks David's out to get him. Saul's got this unholy paranoia. There's one scene where Saul is closing in on David, and David goes and he hides in a cave. And wouldn't you know it, Saul comes into that cave to go to the bathroom. And David sneaks up behind Saul, and he cuts the fringe off of his robe while he's going to the bathroom, and then sneaks back in the cave. And when Saul goes out, and he's with his camp, David calls out and he says, "Listen, Saul, if I wanted to kill you, look what I'm holding." And he looks at his robe and goes, "You are more righteous than I, woe be to me." And he says, "I promise I won't kill you, David." It doesn't last, because Saul's not well. Saul's just out to get David. Anyway, so the battle is raging at Mount Gilboa up here, and Saul's about to die, and the soldiers are closing in, and there's a young guy, an Amalekite, one of these guys, which is really ironic because Saul was supposed to have killed all the Amalekites, and that's why he lost the throne. God said, "I want you to kill every Amalekite, I want you to kill their animals, I want you to kill everything and destroy everything." And Saul preserved the life of the king. And Samuel says, "Saul, what have you done?" He goes, "I did just what the Lord told me to do." He says, "Didn't he tell you to kill everyone?" He says, "Well, I thought I would spare this guy, bring him in, and make a spectacle of him and kill him." And Saul was told by Samuel, "Because of what you've done, you lose the throne, you're done." He didn't listen to what God told him to do. So they're up here fighting, and this Amalekite comes up, and Saul says, "Listen, I'm already wounded. If the Philistines get me, they're going to torture me, they're going to do all kinds of nasty things to me." He says, "Please kill me." So this Amalekite says, "Okay, I'll kill you." And then he takes Saul's crown and his armband, and he brings them with him, and he comes to David and he says, the enemy was closing in around Saul. Saul said, I should kill him, so I did. And here's his crown and his armband. And he says to that man, how dare you kill the Lord's anointed? And he kills the guy. Okay? So, Ishbaal's living up here, and David doesn't have control of the northern tribes yet. And of course somebody goes and kills Ishbaal, and they bring news to David, hey David, we killed Ishbaal, now you can rule the whole works. And of course David says, how dare you kill Saul's son? Those guys get killed. So anytime anyone thinks they're doing David a favor by wiping out his enemies, unless they deserved it, David just says, how dare you do that? But anyway, he becomes the ruler, and he expands the territory, and he expands the territory down to the south. And so David possesses the largest of the kingdoms that you will see in Israel. Notice, you see this little area here? Guess who lives there? The Philistines. And this is called the Gaza Strip. And you wonder why Israel, even to this day, has a hard time controlling the Gaza Strip. Now remember, David's being hunted by Saul. Incidentally, you can read all about this in 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel. It's good reading. It's not lists of genealogies and stuff that'll bog you down. Saul has a beautiful daughter named Michal, or it looks like Michael, okay? And David wants to marry her. And David's best friend is her brother Jonathan. And so David's tight with Saul's family. And Saul, remember, wants David killed. And so he says, well, I'll let you marry her if you can bring me 100 Philistine foreskins. Well, you can imagine David didn't go down there and negotiate with 100 guys and say, you know, will you please be circumcised? He actually had to kill the 100 to get the foreskins. And he brought this bag of foreskins to Saul, and Saul says, it's too late, I gave her to this other guy. And David was not pleased. So when David comes back to Jerusalem, and he says, where's Michal? And she's got a husband, and the husband's all scared that David's going to kill him. And he just says, go away. And so that poor guy just goes off crying. He's just weeping as he leaves. Because here he was married to the king's daughter, now he's being sent off, but at least David didn't kill him. Okay? And when David's bringing the ark to Jerusalem, Michal says to him, what a spectacle you have made yourself, exposing yourself to all the women of the kingdom. And David said, if you think I've made a spectacle of myself, I'll tell you. And she never again got to visit the king's bed, and so she dies childless. Even though she loved David, she criticized him for the way in which he brought the ark to Jerusalem. And on your genealogy, over on the right-hand side of the chart, there's a fuchsia box that has no sons under it. It's the handout I gave you today. If you look at that fuchsia on the very right, Michal is the second daughter of Saul. She loved David, but she ridiculed David in 2 Samuel chapter 6, and it says she died childless. David made sure she had no children. Then look down here. Do you see this? What do you see? You see crowns? Yeah, there's 4 crowns. You got swords with blood. And what's at the bottom? Close. Sheep. 4 lambs. Before we leave this one, though, I also want to lift this up. When you look at this is David's Israel, and what has he done with Jerusalem? He captures it, he makes it the capital, and he brings the ark. So he centered both political and religious power in that one place. Yeah.
The circles that are around Jerusalem, the orange and the yellow.
Yeah, the circles.
And the black background, what is that?
Well, you've got the city skyline here,
Yeah.
and you see that the kingdom radiates out from Jerusalem and gets expanded out, kind of that ripple effect. David expands the kingdom significantly. And it goes almost all the way up to Damascus. You got Syrians up here. And so David has really pushed it out. The northern gate to the old city of Jerusalem is still called the Damascus Gate because it is at the end of what is called the Damascus Road. So there's 12 different gates to the city of Jerusalem, and the Damascus Gate is the grandest of the gates if you go there to this day. Okay, so on your sheet, I don't know if it's light enough for you to read, but in the upper left-hand corner, you have Ahinoam of Jezreel, which is a wife, and she gives birth to a son named Amnon. So Amnon is David's oldest son. It's the firstborn, the favorite one. And I want you to go over to this one. Well, what am I doing? I can do this. I want you to go over to Ma'akah. She's the daughter of King Talmi of Geshur. And what the reason this becomes important is because Absalom's going to do something really stupid that could get him killed. And so it says, and he flees to Geshur. Why would he go to Geshur? Because that's where Grandpa is. He flees to Grandpa's house to protect him. Okay? So anyway, Amnon, you got a little pedigree under him. It says he rapes Tamar. Well, if you jump over here, you see who Tamar is. Tamar is the sister of Absalom, and she's beautiful. And Amnon loves his half-sister. He just thinks she's the most beautiful woman. He's obsessed with her. And so he fakes being sick, and he asks his father, David, can you have my sister Tamar come and bake some food for me and feed me? And it would be really nice. And so David says, hey, Tamar, go make some food for your brother Amnon. And he tells all the other servants, leave the room. And when Tamar brings the cakes close, he tries to force himself upon her, and he does. And she says, this shouldn't be done. This is not so. You know, you're disgracing the king's daughter. And she just tries to give all the reasons, but he just won't take no for an answer. And as soon as he gets what he wants, then he's repulsed by her even more than he was attracted to her. When he finally got what he wanted, he decided that's not what I want. And so now she's damaged goods, and she lives in the king's household as well. And she also tears her robe. You know, when you're pure, you get to wear a robe. And when you're not pure, you don't get the robe. And he said, just be quiet about it, don't tell anybody. And she goes back and tears her robe. And so everybody knows something happened. And Absalom is livid. He wants to kill Amnon. When David gets word of it, he says, there will be no killing of Amnon. And Absalom flees for 2 years and lives here. Then they say, okay, David, how long is your son going to be away? You better invite him back. And he comes back. And he lives under David's nose for 2 years. And then he says, you know, it's time for all of us brothers to go out on a sheep herding expedition. And sure enough, they go out, and David talks Amnon into going out with Absalom. And Amnon is killed by Absalom. And David thinks that Absalom killed all of the sons. And so David is just livid, and Absalom has to flee again for 2 years and comes back. But when he comes back, he doesn't just come back. Now remember, in those days, the king would sit outside the city gates and would hear cases, and he would issue judgments to the people. The king was the arbitrator. Well, Absalom sat outside the city gate and he said, you know, David doesn't have time to hear your cases. You know, he's really too busy for you people, but I'll listen to your case and I'll tell you what's important. And he does this all the time, and he's winning over people from Israel to be his people. And then he goes down to Hebron and declares himself king. So Absalom kills Amnon. That's the first murder of a line in Kings. And an exceptionally long, I mean, this story is fascinating. If you haven't read through 2 Kings for a while, it's worth the read. He declares himself king, and he's got a lot of people following him, and he chases David out of Jerusalem. And David leaves 10 concubines behind to care for the house. And when Absalom gets to Jerusalem, one of the first things he does is, up on the roof, he publicly goes into each of the 10 concubines. Because here's a question for you. Who sleeps with the king's concubines? The king. And when he did that, he said, I'm the king. And David got chased out, and he's getting chased through the tribe of Benjamin. Remember, what tribe was Saul from? Benjamin. Where did they want the rest of the kings to come from? Benjamin. Who got rid of the Benjaminites? They're blaming David. So when David is fleeing for his life, there's a lot of stories, sub-stories within the stories here, as you can tell. But there's a guy named Shimei the Archite. And Shimei is a Benjaminite. And when David goes through, Shimei goes, serves you right, David, you murderer, you lousy guy. You know, you deserve to be chased out. Good for you, you think. And he's throwing rocks at him and stuff. And David's troops go, hey, David, you want we should kill him? And he goes, no, it may be that this is a judgment from God. Let him live. And then, so David gets chased out. And long story short, Absalom and company go out to chase him and kill him, and Absalom gets caught in an oak tree. He's riding a donkey, and he gets clotheslined, and he's hung in this oak tree, but he can't get down. And David's right-hand general, Joab, sees Absalom hanging there, and David says, if any of you come upon Absalom, nobody kill him. And Joab puts 3 spears into his chest. Now remember, anyone who thinks they're doing David a favor, it's going to blow up on them. Well, anyway, David weeps over Absalom, and there's a tomb in Jerusalem today, even to this day. Absalom built a tomb to himself before he died because he didn't have any children. And he said, I want to make sure somebody honors me. And Absalom's tomb still stands to this day. Well, anyway, David comes back, and there's Shimei the Archite goes, I'm sorry, David, all that stuff I said about you, I didn't really mean it, David. Please don't hurt me. And David says, don't worry, Shimei, I won't kill you. But when David gets to his deathbed, he calls Solomon to his side. He says, Solomon, I'm about to go the way of all flesh. He said, you remember Shimei the Archite, how he taunted me when I left town? Don't let his gray head go to the grave in peace. What does that mean? Take him out. You know, make sure you kill Shimei. Okay. Remember, David said, I won't kill you. He didn't say anything about Solomon not killing him. And Joab is general. David's trusted right-hand man all the way through. On his deathbed, he says, you know Joab, my general, who killed Abner in time of peace and killed Absalom, don't let his gray head go to the grave in peace either. So on his deathbed, David's telling Solomon who to take out. And you're wondering, how did David get a son named Solomon anyway? Well, if you look on your handy-dandy sheet, over here you have Bathsheba, who was the wife of Uriah the Hittite, the daughter of Eliam, and the granddaughter of Ahithophel. And there's a reason for all that detail, because the kings send his troops out to go to war, and David, now I've learned this living in Arizona, if you live in a 2-story house, you can see the backyards of your neighbors. Okay? And David was up on his roof, and he saw Bathsheba coming up out of the water, out of the bath. A little piece of history is that when a woman enters her menstrual cycle, she's unclean for 2 weeks. At the end of those 2 weeks, she must go into a ritual bath and come out again, and not only is she clean, but she's also ovulating. And David sent for Bathsheba and said, you got to come over to the house, and he lay with her, and he got her pregnant. The problem is, her husband is one of his soldiers, and he's out fighting. So David goes, I got this, I'll fix this. He says, Uriah, come back from the front. You've been fighting hard, you deserve a break. Why don't you go home and spend the night with your wife? So what does Uriah do? He sleeps on the front porch. He says to the king, when the troops are all out there fighting and they're in their tents and stuff and laying on the ground, how can I enjoy the creature comforts of home? That just wouldn't be right. So here, Uriah is too righteous. David's trying to trick him into sleeping with his wife and making him think it's his baby. But it doesn't work. Uriah's too righteous, which means that David had no business, when his troops were out suffering, having Bathsheba over. He was out of bounds on multiple levels. So, then what does David do? He writes a note, and he says, Uriah, you must deliver these important instructions to the front, to my general Joab. And so David has Uriah transport the instructions to Joab, and here are the instructions. Joab, I want you to send Uriah to the front of the battle, right up against the city wall, and when he's at the point, I want everybody else to pull back and leave him alone. And of course, when he's fighting them all by himself, he gets killed. And so when they send the report back, he says, this happened, this happened, this happened. And by the way, Uriah also fell in battle. They put it as the footnote of the battle report. So David manages to get Uriah killed. And then Bathsheba gives birth to a son, and the prophet Nathan comes to him and says, you know, David, there was a man who had thousands of sheep, and a guest came to his house, and the guest, he said, I need to prepare a sheep for this guy. And he had this neighbor who had one pet sheep. I mean, it was his favorite lamb, and it spent the day with him, and it even kept him warm at night. And so he was loath to take one of his own sheep, so he goes and takes the neighbor's pet, and he kills it and serves it to the visitor. And Nathan says, so David, what do you think should be done with that man? And David says, the man deserves to die. He ought to pay him back at least fourfold for what he took. And Nathan goes, you are the man. You had everything. You're the king of Israel. You've got everything you've ever wanted. You've got more wives than you can handle. And yet you had to take Uriah's wife. He goes, therefore, the child born to you will die. So David has lost Amnon, he's lost Absalom, he lost the unnamed baby, because that when that baby was born, it lived 7 days. And you know what happens normally on the 8th day? Circumcision, and the child is named. This child dies nameless and not as a child of the covenant. And so David loses a third son, So he's lost 3 sons, and so he is ending up having to give back 4 lambs for the one he took. And some of these, you'll see Adonijah in the story as well, because he's dead, Adonijah's next in line. And so when David is on his deathbed, Adonijah goes down to Hebron, and he says, I'm king. Meanwhile, back in Jerusalem, Bathsheba goes up to David. Hey, David, you remembered how you said Solomon could be king? He never really did, but she's just telling him on his deathbed, you remember how Solomon could be king? Yeah, I remember. Okay. So he makes Solomon king in Jerusalem. So now you got 2 sons claiming to be kings in 2 different towns, and you hear the cheer go up from Hebron. It's only 6 miles away, and you hear the cheer go up from Jerusalem, and all of a sudden you've got 2 more people jockeying for succession, and it ends up, Solomon ends up being the one who becomes king. And this is a bonus trivial piece for you. Remember when Absalom chased David out of town and made himself king? His advisor was Ahithophel, and Ahithophel was never wrong. He was one of the best advisors the king ever had. So Absalom, when David's leaving town, he tells his advisor Hushai, he says, I want you to stay here. But Hushai says, I want to go with you, David. He goes, no, stay here and pledge your loyalty to my son, Absalom. And when Absalom asks Ahithophel for advice, you give him other advice to try to defeat Ahithophel's advice. So when David's fleeing town, Ahithophel says, Absalom, take 12,000 troops, go after David, crush him right now. Let's end this thing. Kill David only, and everyone will follow you. And Absalom goes, that's pretty good advice. But he says, Hushai, what do you say? You were my father's advisor. And he goes, oh, you know your father. He goes, he's a fierce warrior. If you go after him now, he'll be like a mad lion or a bear. You won't stand a chance against him. You'll have to kill everybody to get to him. And besides that, he's smart enough to go and hide where you won't find him. And Absalom goes, this time Hushai's advice is better than Ahithophel's. And you might say, why does Ahithophel want David dead? Look who Ahithophel is. Bathsheba was his granddaughter. David committed adultery with his granddaughter. David killed his granddaughter's husband. David's sin is the reason why Bathsheba lost her firstborn. Ahithophel has no love for David. So, when Absalom says, I'm going with Hushai the Archite's advice, Ahithophel does something strange. He packs his bags, he goes home, he puts his affairs in order, and then he kills himself. Because he knows he's as good as dead. Because if Absalom follows Hushai's advice, Absalom will be defeated. And Ahithophel's been leading the charge against David. He knows he's a dead man. And as soon as he saw that he wasn't going to be listened to, so we got Amnon being killed by Absalom, and Absalom being killed in battle, and good old Adonijah. When he tried to be the king in Hebron, Solomon ends up killing Adonijah, and Solomon ends up with the crown. And next week, we'll see how well Solomon does with all things, and how quickly it falls apart after his death. But I would suggest, if you want to read, I didn't read the text in the book to you because you can do that, okay? But what I wanted to do was kind of whet your appetite for getting into the Bible and reading 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel, and you're going to come back and go, whoa. Likewise, if you manage to sneak in Judges before you do, you're going to go, wow. So Judges, 1 and 2 Samuel, and the nice thing is, you've got a couple weeks to do it, because next week I'm at Gold Canyon, and so Pastor Roger's in charge of the forum, and we've talked about that. The next week we're going to have a special guest presenter, someone who used to be a Mormon, and who got out of Mormonism. And then the week, and that actually is my daughter's wedding, why I'm not here. And then last but not least, I will be back the following Sunday and we'll continue. So if you want to read Judges, 1 and 2 Samuel, that'd be a good thing for you to do during the next couple weeks. That's a boatload of info, but when you read the story, you'll go, I just skimmed across the top. Let's pray. Lord God, we give you thanks for messed up families. Even someone like King David in all his glory had a really messed up family. Yet you worked through him, which is a sign of your grace. And so, Lord, no matter how messed up we are, you can work through us as well. Lord, I pray you'd strengthen each of these servants for the journey ahead of them. Bless their reading of your word, that they might be strengthened to serve you in ways they didn't even know possible. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you.
You're welcome.